Welcome to the Fountainhill Symposium. This is the first of 4 presentations around the topic of biodiversity. My name is Sally Frost. I'm your technical host for the sessions, and I'm the Manager of Public Relations at UKZN College of Agriculture, Engineering and Science. A very warm welcome. We are online because of COVID, which is actually beneficial in that we have people from all over South Africa and some international guests today, which is very nice. Just to mention some house rules, this is a Zoom meeting as opposed to a Zoom webinar to make it more interactive. However, because it's set up like this, please can everyone make sure they are muted to prevent background noise. On the bottom left of your screen, you will see the mute button. And if you want to save data, you can also turn off your videos, which is also at the bottom left. At the top right of your screen is a button that says View, where you can toggle between Speaker View and Gallery View. I would suggest that you put your screens on speaker view to get a better viewing of the slides. I have my co-host this afternoon is Christine Cuno. In case I lose connection or have a power outage, she will pick up, but hopefully we won't have any problems like that. And then in the middle of your screen at the bottom, you will see there's a chat facility. Please use this facility to pose questions to our speaker today, and then I will monitor those questions and we will have an interactive session after the presentation. We are being recorded and you will be sent a recording after today. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Sershen Naidoo, who is the host for this afternoon. So Sershen, over to you.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you to the technical team for realizing this event. I don't want to waste any time today. I just want to set the scene for the talk that is about to take place and then hand over to our speaker. You are attending what would have been the 5th symposium, in-person symposium held by Fountainhill Estate. However, the pandemic allowed us to move onto an online platform for this symposium. And it was an incredible opportunity, actually, for Fountainhill to come together with its partners to co-host this event. So the event is actually co-hosted for the first time by all 4 partners, Fountainhill, the Institute of Natural Resources, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and SANBI. Now, the decision to co-host was in effect, a polygamous marriage of parties, agendas, interests, ideas, and therefore required very, very careful thought around the theme for the symposium and the invited speakers. This compromise gave birth to the theme for this symposium, which is the Food, Water, Energy Nexus on Biodiversity. Now, the idea for the theme was also inspired by nexus thinking that is developing internationally in an attempt to understand and deal with the interdependencies which exist within the complex natural and human systems. This nexus thinking is becoming increasingly important as we begin to push against the planetary boundaries of resource use and emerging resource constraints. The nexus becomes even more relevant when we think about managing resources within a pandemic. In fact, what is emerging in the literature now is that many countries, both from the developed and developing world, may have to revisit their advances and ambitions with regards to the Sustainable Development Goals. So an integrated consideration of food, water, energy, land, and biodiversity is essential in local economic development planning. And that's exactly the reasoning behind the choice of today's theme. However, When you look at this nexus in a global context, it may be a very different picture to countries like South Africa. And in fact, the most pertinent question in the South African context with regards to this water, energy, food, biodiversity nexus is how this nexus could be approached and can improve a country with high environmental and social vulnerability. And I hope that the social scientists amongst our attendees today challenge our speaker in the discussion session around this issue. It is against this backdrop that I have the pleasure of introducing to you someone who, in working at the coalface, can broaden our understanding of the impacts of land use and management strategies on biodiversity, namely Dr. Morne du Plessis, the Chief Executive of WWF South Africa since 2007, holding memberships of several trusts and advisory boards. He is the chair of the Academic Advisory Board of the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Studies, and amongst his many positions that he's held over the years, probably the most distinguished of them has been the director of one of only 6 international centers of excellence at the Percy Fitzpatrick Institute of the University of Cape Town. Before that, he held research and management positions at the former Natal Parks Board and University of California at Berkeley. Now, the reasoning behind bringing him in as our first speaker today is largely around the fact that he's not shy about his opinions. He's never been. In fact, he was awarded the South African National Research Foundation's President's Award in 1996 for similar reasons. And in 2000, he was listed among the Mail and Guardian's most promising 100 young South Africans in the new millennium. Morne holds a PhD in zoology from the University of Cape Town, and it is my extreme pleasure to now hand you over to Dr. Morne du Plessis.
Thank you very much, Sershen. Very much appreciated. And I think everyone watching will realize that 20 years can turn a promising young person into a more senior citizen. So it's very nice to talk to you. I had a look at the guest list, and I'm really delighted to see many old familiar names, good friends, and then many new colleagues from across the country, from government, from NGOs, and from universities. So you will understand that when one gets approached to give a talk, perhaps as much as a year in advance, the easiest thing to do is to say yes and to agree to do it. The more difficult thing is to get given a topic of the breadth of the one that I have to cover today, and to do that in roughly 20 minutes. So I better get cracking. And I hope that you will not mind that I give very broad background at times, and sometimes you will probably find that there is something interesting for you to grab onto. So just to make sure that we all get onto the page, I've structured the presentation as follows. And much of this is old hats, but I think for younger colleagues, it's maybe useful just to remind ourselves of these things. And then to go through looking at drivers, threats, all the way to taking stock. And when I take stock of biodiversity, I will do that in the global context. Much of it applies very specifically also to South Africa. And then to talk about the road ahead. So with that, let me try and address the question of why biodiversity and ecosystems matter. Well, of course, biodiversity matters because it inspires, it's beautiful. Some of us are absolutely passionate about nature. But more than that, while we're sitting here talking, many of our friends in nature are hard at work providing services. As you can see, the bee that's centered here, carrying pollen and moving around between plants in order to make sure that when you sit down to dinner this evening, you're likely to have about 70% of what's on your plate will be the result of this role that organisms like this bee will have played in the pollination of your food crop. So very, very important services. And of course, we know that nature underpins our entire existence. Everything from being our home to food, shelter, medicines, and so on. And if one then unpacks the services that are provided by the constituents of biodiversity, the function of biodiversity, then many of us will be familiar with this diagram. I don't intend talking through them, but we know that there are a range of provisioning services that nature provides for us, regulating services, supporting services, and of course those that we term cultural services. So I've already spoken about that bee as a significant player in the pollination system, which is one of the regulating services. But of course, natural systems, intact systems along river courses will slow down excessive flow events, will attenuate floods. And when one puts all of these things together, you realize that nature is putting on a platter without thanks much that drives our economy and everything about human life. This could qualify as a horrendogram. All I want to show here is that if you look at the arrows and the direction of the arrows and the blocks to the right against, and let's not even read the particular services that are provided, but in general, the services of nature are under severe threat. The trends are significantly downwards. So other than just a handful of these services where the arrows are going upwards, they are without fail pointing downwards, and significantly so, and these are well-established facts. So we cannot talk about nature and about biodiversity without, of course, situating it within our broader society. And of course, economies, our economy is a part of what society does. And I think the perversity of how we've lived in the past has generally been to look at this in the reverse order and to see the economy as the driver of everything, that human well-being and happiness comes as a result of the economy without taking into account the biosphere. And of course, these are very, very tightly interlinked and dependent on the biosphere. This is an unpacking also then of the Sustainable Development Goals, with which many of you will be familiar, and many of them address specifically issues around the biosphere in a very broad sense: life on land, life below water, for example, clean water, climate action. These are sustainable development goals that are focused significantly on ensuring that there's a sustainable base. And I'll just touch very, very briefly on a few conventions to make sure that we all on the same page as far as how these have played their various roles. So, and that I'll do by answering the question whether biodiversity or nature or ecosystem services, I use those as synonyms. They're not strictly synonyms, but have these been effectively foregrounded? So I've just referred to the Sustainable Development Goals, and the intention there was not to give you a lecture on sustainable development goals or to unpack them. But in 2012, the SDGs were developed. Now that is very much focused on development and doing development in a way that reduces inequality, reduces poverty, improves human well-being, and to do so sustainably. And I think when we look at the year 2012, when the SDGs were developed, I can probably say that that was one of the more significant moments when what many people listening to me speak now will have known much of this well in advance, but the fact that society, that anything environmental can also be regarded as social, because environmental issues and social issues are so inextricably linked. And the same for anything economic, so inextricably linked to the biological base, the biosphere, and its sustenance. And I think this penny dropped globally when the SDGs were developed. Of course, many of us are familiar with the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I tacked on the Paris logo because the Paris Agreement was struck only in 2015. But the first, some of the very early clear warnings that were given to the American government by Dr. Schneider in the 1980s was like a canary in the coal mine, announcing that that the world is at risk. And so in the 1980s already, these projections were made somewhat vaguely at the time, but they were quite clear. And as we went over the decades up to 2015, over a 35-year period, it took us 35 years to get to the point where nations agreed to keeping global warming below 2 degrees and ideally as close to 1.5 degrees Celsius as possible. That was a significant shift. That doesn't mean we've achieved it or that we're on our way to achieving it, but that was a significant mind shift in the climate change world. But if we talk about the Convention on Biodiversity, because biodiversity is pretty much our topic here today, in 1992, the Rio Convention was held and came into being, and very clear targets were set around biodiversity goals. That included sustainable use as well as benefit sharing and so on. And what was known to many already in the 80s and 90s, we're still struggling to get proper traction for. And what's happened, if we look at these 3 very important conventions in relation to the topic that we're talking about today, the Convention on Biodiversity, nature in short, has been significantly neglected. And I will point out a little bit later in this presentation some of the opportunities that exist going forward. And I think it's important that wherever you come from, that you also understand that there's a role to play in one way or the other. So I talked about the canary in the coal mine. I think biodiversity could use the amphibian, the frog in the pond, because this is a very, very early warning system of particular habitats, very much like the canary in the coal mine that stops singing when humans are not aware that oxygen quality is changing, the early warning system, as it were. So let's look at the drivers and threats. And I could talk for an hour about this, so I am going to rush through this a little bit. But I wanted to, and I'm drawing extensively from the Living Planet reports. Every 2 years, the Zoological Society London, in partnership with WWF globally, publishes the Living Planet report. And so I'm drawing liberally from these Living Planet reports. And when we look at the main threats to biodiversity, we're basically looking at habitat degradation, habitat change, habitat loss as the primary driver of biodiversity loss. Exploitation, that's the way in which we harvest or over-harvest wild species. I suppose it's in blue in this pie chart because one tends to think of fisheries, but you could also think of forests, but the harvesting of natural goods and so on. But our focus today is significantly on changes in land use, habitat degradation, change, and loss. And over the last few decades, we've seen what is known, or what's referred to as, the Great Acceleration. I included this particular chart not because any of these specific figures are of any more significant importance than the others. There are many tens of these that show very, very similar patterns, but essentially, for most of us on this call, we would not have been born before the 50s. There are a handful of people who have been born before that, but the majority of us would have been born, and I exclude myself, but post 1980. And you can just see this massive acceleration in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, in freshwater use, tropical forest loss, and of course, in human population growth, which of course, I don't need to tell you, but places immense pressures on the systems that sustain us, not for their own sakes, but for our sakes. And of course, when we talk about these figures, and top left is population growth, there are many who argue around issues of human population, but I think just to make it clear that 10% of the wealthiest people living the most extravagant qualities of life are responsible for half of the greenhouse gas emissions from their consumption, compared to the reverse, 50% of the poorest people being responsible for only 10% of that. This really puts things into perspective in relation to the issue of consumption. Today is not the day to drill into this much deeper, but let's move on. So let's briefly take stock. And of course, in the Living Planet reports, with which many of you will be familiar, you see this every 2 years, you see this slippage. Despite our very, very best efforts, organizations like my own, organizations like those for which you work, whether they're universities or government departments or NGOs, we all collectively putting a massive effort in to try and stem the tide of biodiversity loss. Because that's the family jewels, that's the base upon which all of the economic and social activity happens. Yet it keeps slipping. So there are many indicators, but there's one singular trend, and that trend is in the wrong direction. You'll see why I say that, not just downwards, because one of the trends of a particular indicator is upwards, but it goes the wrong way, not the way we want it to go. Yes. So of course, the Living Planet report has a Living Planet index that it uses. And data in the Living Planet report has been collected from 1970 onwards. The 2020 Living Planet report includes data only up until 2016. So this is not an old graph, this is the latest, because it takes time for these studies to be published. But basically, this is a cumulative index using 16,500 populations of over 4,000 vertebrate species that have been intensively studied. And essentially, there's a 60%, 68% loss compared to 1970 in the abundance, the average abundance of these populations. This doesn't mean that 68% have gone extinct. This means that there is a 68% reduction in abundance of these species in the populations that they've been studied. So it's an aggregate. It's like a index that one uses, the FTSE 100, if you in the investment world, or yeah, it's a basket of species in this case, well-studied vertebrate species. And it's even worse when we look and we separate out only freshwater species, the abundance of freshwater species measured in the same way. The index is now disaggregated from the overall index, but an 84% deterioration or move in the wrong direction. And this clearly tells us that our freshwater systems are particularly hard hit globally. So there are many indicators of biodiversity. So I showed you the Living Planet Index, the top left one, in some detail. I'm not going to talk through the others, but there are others that you can see are all following, showing severe declines or changes in the direction that we would not want to see it happen. And this is the index. It's a well-known one, the ecological footprint, which is measured against, so it's humanity's ecological footprint measured against the Earth's capacity to produce these goods and services and to absorb our waste products. And you can see that carbon is by far the biggest footprint. So if you follow the green dotted line, that pretty much is the Earth's biocapacity. If you weren't going into debt, you'd have to go back to 1970, where the line crossed, where our footprint became bigger than what the Earth can produce and sequester in terms of our waste products, greenhouse gas emissions in particular. And that now in 2016, we're looking at the requirements of, before we even start producing food or fiber, we require a whole planet to sequester the greenhouse gases that we are putting up into the atmosphere. So, of course, that cannot happen. So that is why we're getting an accumulation, an increasing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I've given you, you know, some of these very well-known statistics and trends of how biodiversity is changing, but we simply have to aim higher. And the jargon that's being used in the hallways of these multilateral agreements, in the hallways of some of the institutions that we work with, where we talk about bending the curve of biodiversity loss. And so the Living Planet report of 2020 specifically focuses on this. And I think what we need to talk about, and I said at the start, and that's why, you know, these conventions are not everyone's cup of tea. They're certainly not mine. But we cannot just keep producing good science, good statistics showing how the ship is sinking, how we're going backwards. We simply have to mainstream the knowledge and make sure that we go on a sustainable path. But if we look at 1992, so we're looking at the biodiversity index and the dark black slope of the line as it's decreased coming towards current. The Convention of Biodiversity, the Rio Convention in 1992 set about stemming that loss. It included targets of 10% of land and sea to be formally protected. These were targets that nations signed up to, and that had to be achieved within a particular time period. Of course, those targets haven't been achieved, but we see that the curve of the biodiversity index is steadily dropping. COP6, the Conference of Parties, the 6th Convention of Biodiversity, again set targets for 2010. In 2010, there was another significant resetting of targets. So you can see this happens at sort of decadal events. The Aichi targets. The Aichi targets, despite the fact that the 10% hadn't been hit previously, set targets of 17% for land, terrestrial areas, and freshwater systems to be under some form of formal protection, and 10% of our seas, and so on. And yet we get to 2020 when the Aichi targets had to be met. We still haven't delivered them because we keep seeing a drop in the biodiversity index, and the opportunity that sits before us, accepting that there have been hollow victories. You know, you can set a target and think you've really done something, but if you don't achieve it and you just set a more difficult one, that's a pretty hollow victory. But what I believe, and many people in our field believe, is that we are ready now to look at putting together a new deal for people and nature that brings together the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the climate agreement, and biodiversity as a foundation to both of those other conventions. So then what we do is we go about doing some modeling. So essentially, I've tried to keep it quite simple here. These are not my models. They come from the Living Planet report, but let me talk you through them. So business as usual is the gray, black gray line at the bottom. The pale black line is the projection beyond where we are now. And essentially business as usual has in it the current Aichi targets of 17% have taken us on this pathway. In other words, it's not bent the curve, and it doesn't look like it's going to do so soon. So 17% unmet or met is not going to get us there. So business as usual is not an option. The green line represents a modeling of significant enhanced conservation actions, set-asides, recovery of populations, etc. That alone will potentially, if these targets are met, start bending the curve in 2050. But if we include production and consumption actions on top of these conservation actions, the set-asides, the sustainable management of land, but going much further, we are able to bring that bending of the curve forward. So again, it seems a little bit hollow unless everybody's on board. And this is what's happened in the climate conventions. Lots of hot air, lots of talk, until people see it's, and businesses see it's going to hit their pockets, governments see it's going to really increase inequality. So these findings make it clear that only an integrated approach combining ambitious conservation with measuring, targeting the drivers of habitat conversion. And these converters of habitats are significantly in the production systems and consumption patterns of ourselves. But these need to be included in order to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. I'm going to move on faster. I could pause here a little bit longer, but again, models are only models, but it provides the kind of thinking for policymakers at the very least to start thinking about why it's important. We're not doing this for the sake of any individual species necessarily. We're doing this to keep these systems intact in order to sustain life as we see it. I'll move quite fast through these. These three graphs look at the impacts of three different scenarios on biodiversity, climate change, and food security, respectively. The Half Earth strategy, this is something that was significantly punted by E.O. Wilson, a top academic from Harvard who's very well respected. But he went very extreme in saying the only way we are going to bend the curve is to set aside half of every ecoregion in the world to protect that for biodiversity conservation, and the other half needs to be used to sustain human needs. So in a way, the half that's protected is used as humanity's life support system, and the other one is the engine that produces the goods. Now, of course, that's quite a theoretical kind of argument. This is the brown or orange track on each of these. And then perhaps a more realistic scenario is the one of which is referred to as sharing the planet scenario, which is focused on conserving areas that support and enhance the provisioning of various ecosystem services specifically. So ones such as carbon storage, pollination, pest control, by adding high carbon forests, focusing on riparian zones, water catchments, urban green spaces, etc., and key biodiversity areas, and together covering up to 30% of the global terrestrial area. But in addition to that, the scenario relies heavily on agricultural production to move towards advanced agricultural systems, agroforestry, and diversification of farming systems. So it's not just the conservation focus on setting aside, it's significantly focusing on shifting production and consumption in this process. So let me just wrap up. The path ahead, the opportunity that I said was the New Deal for People and Nature. 2020 was the year in which the big conventions were going to be held in order to nail this down. Of course, as a result of COVID, this has not happened. It's been kicked down the road a little bit. It's also given us, I say us, meaning everyone listening here, the opportunity to refine some of the thinking. And I'll just touch on what is here. It's quite a busy graph, so let's just focus inside the two red circles. So basically, what will be negotiated, and environmentalists, sociologists, social scientists, and economists are aligning quite tightly around the fact that we have to protect and restore natural habitats because of the massive deterioration that's unsustainable that's happening as we speak. The solutions relate to 30% of our global surface area being sustainably managed and protected. And then, of course, a big focus on restoration of natural habitats. So those of you into restoration ecology, big job, because we've got to turn You know, if you sit next to the Ganges, the Ganga River in India, that in 20 years' time should be a river that you can scoop water from and drink wherever you are on its along the catchment. These things are possible. The technologies are there. There are lots of young, bright people like those of you listening here as well who can do that. We have to safeguard the diversity of life. These are like the pop rivets in an airplane wing. If you start taking those rivets out, at some point it'll be one too many and the wing will come off. We have to halt extinctions and at the same time do species population recovery. There's work for everyone here. And then most significantly, I suppose, in addition to our normal conservation goals, we have to halve the footprint of production and consumption in order to bend that curve. We have to transition to sustainable practices. I will end with this slide. It's not the canary in the coal mine, it's the future in our hands. I'll hand over and stop sharing if I can. Somehow I've lost my, oh yes, I'll stop sharing and hand back to Sershen.
Thank you, Morne. What a privilege. Just to have somebody take the time to take data that is usually used to boggle people and break it down into a digestible format. And I must compliment you for that. And I'm sure all the attendees here enjoy that as well. There are a few questions, but I'd just like to touch on a few things that you mentioned. Please give me a creative license as chair to extract some of the own meanings and learnings that I've extracted from your talk. So I think we are all walking a very, very thin line between lip service and protection of ecosystem services. And I think we need to be careful, as you mentioned, in looking at models as models and not replacing unachieved targets with more difficult ones. That's the first point. I think the second point is that there's a need for a social environmental compromise. And the human nature contract needs to be revisited. You know, the circumstances, the context, both socially and environmentally has changed. And it is not business as usual. COVID has forced us into a pandemic mind frame. And this is forcing us to rethink a lot. But the good thing about it is that it's done a social experiment for us, in the sense that it's withdrawn people from the natural environment and shown us in real time what climate scientists could not do with their predictive science. It's shown us that once you withdraw those anthropogenic activities, this is how nature can rebound. That's the second point. The last point is one that has been fizzing around in my head throughout your talk. There seems to be what I see as 5 distinct groups of people in this dialogue that you have brought to the table today. Sensationalists, idealists, realists, and denialists. And as scientists, we need to figure out which ist we belong to, or whether we are going to take those 5 ists and consider them missed. So what I mean by that is that I don't believe that we should exclude any of these individuals or groups of individuals, and I repeat them: the sensationalists, the idealists, the denialists, and the realists. I don't think we should exclude any of them from the conversation, because the nature of the beast that we are dealing with right now is that it has a split personality. And the way in which nature is responding is so variable, so unmeasurable at times, but at the same time, there is a need for us to bring different opinions to the table. So the question, the overall question that I want to pose to you and the audience here today is that how do we arrive at that social environmental compromise? And how do we arrive at that social environmental compromise when it is difficult to think about the need to conserve Scadoxus pernicious when you don't have a toilet to sit on? So I'm going to open it up to the floor, Morne, I will give you time at the end to come in with your closing comments, and I'm going to hand over to Sally now, who will direct some of the questions that have come through.
Thanks, Sershen. There were maybe three main themes, and Morne, I hope you've got a pen. I'll say them all, and then you can answer them all, because I see we're running out of time here. The first one links up to what Sershen is saying here about social environmental compromise. Living in a world where there's so much inequality and poverty, some people can see conservation as an elitist occupation if you're on the breadline. Is social transformation not the first priority before academic research? That was the one question. Then the second question deals with the issue of governments and policymakers and who are the people who actually have the power to get things done. So you might have ideal biodiversity targets, but are governments going to buy into this? And how can you get the message across to decision makers and have targets that they are actually going to buy into and action? And then the third main theme, and I'll leave it at this given the time, is the whole question of attitudes out there towards biodiversity. You have pessimists, you have optimists. How can you shape a message that is going to reach everyone? Let me leave it with those three questions.
Morne, this will not feature in your key performance indices, so don't feel pressurized to answer all the questions posed to you.
Look, thanks, Sally, and thanks, Sershen, and thanks to those who've posed the questions. Of course, these questions are all absolutely pertinent. So let me quickly look at the social and environmental compromise, as it was referred to. But I would say that we create a dichotomy. I was trying to say that anything environmental is as much social as it is environmental. In other words, we have to stop thinking that what we're doing has no bearing on people. So we're talking about a new deal for people and nature. Some people switch it and say nature and people. I think the vast majority of people from the political South talk about a new deal for people and nature. And that's why the Sustainable Development Goals are fundamentally interwoven. And I think this is a false dichotomy if we start pitting, if for example, if we have a dam with 100 fish in and 1,000 people need to eat from, and that's the only source of food, then clearly this is not going to be sustainable, and we have to find other ways. It's going to do no one any good to just drive the resource to extinction and then just move to the next option. So in many fisheries, marine systems, fisheries, fish stocks have been rebuilt. In fact, that's the SASSI Sustainable Seafood Initiative. There are cases whereby fishery improvement projects are done in order to make sure that a fishery can move from red to an orange rating, or from orange to green. The goal is always to get it onto green so that it is sustainable. But in order to get it there, you've got to back off, to let the stocks come back, and then you've got to tackle it with science. So yes, if somebody is hungry and you tell them you can't eat one of those 100 fish because we'll have more later, today you've got to survive, and it's a very, very difficult challenge. But we can, you know, I think most people can understand that once the fish has gone from that fishery, that it becomes far more difficult to build it back than if you paused earlier. You create greater offtake yield possibilities and then take it off. So I think we have to understand that. The fact that some people might think that conservation of biodiversity is an elitist issue. Yes, there are a narrow slither of people who are well fed, who sleep well, who pay lots of money to go into very pampered kind of game experiences. And but that, I think, is that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about that happens on the one hand, that creates jobs and opportunities, but at the same time, we're looking at making sure that that we preserve the basis for life, to make sure that the pollination systems, I keep coming back to the pollination systems because it's a no-brainer. Water and pollination systems are just things that everybody must, without a biological understanding, understand that you need water and you need food, and without a pollinator or without a river providing you with clean water, your human well-being is severely compromised. Of course, there are people who could answer that question much better than I do, and I'm a bit pushed for time. Let's just look at governments and policymakers have the power to change things. So how do we get them and their buy-in? I think we should not leave it only to governments and policymakers. I think business has a fundamental role to play. So a lot of the arguments we made, and I didn't have time to do that today, but a lot of the arguments that we make have to be made in relation to basic economics. And that is not a very difficult thing to do. So when I read an article recently written by someone whose name I forget, but it's a well-known Indian professor who spoke about the London School of Economics, a very well-known center for deepening the understanding of how economies work. And when he asked the question of people at LSE, do you have any discussions around your basic natural base upon which you withdraw resources and against which you trade off future income? And the answer was that yes, you know, nothing specific, but there is mention of it. Now, the reality is that if you study economics, you have to understand not ecology like a deep ecologist, but you have to understand the basics. There are economists on this call who understand ecological issues very, very well. And we need not just more of the same, not just my type of skills in biological issues, but we need social scientists, we need economists, we need people in the finance work, we need marketers, communicators, we need everyone. It's not just governments and policymakers. How do we change attitudes to biodiversity? I think the first, and maybe these discussions that Fountainhill discussions that go ahead about food, water, and energy, I mean, that's the basic products of biodiversity. Biodiversity is not just the individual species, it is also what the collective of species are delivering for us. And I think those arguments can be made very powerfully, very strongly. You don't have to love the Diza barbata the way I do in order to make a difference for biodiversity. You can play a much bigger role in order to get people from other walks of life to also bring their thinking and their thought to bear. I'm waffling a bit now, so I'll pass back to Sershen.
Thank you, Morne. I've been following the conversation that has been taking place in the background while you've been speaking and giving your answers. And yes, I think a lot of the participants agree with what you have been saying. Another point that has emerged in the discussion while you've been talking is the multidimensionality of the problem that we're facing, and the fact that a multidimensional problem needs a multidimensional sense of approach. And this is twofold: multi-stakeholder engagement and multidisciplinary science. And I'm starting to also think about whether we are using the right language, and whether maybe perhaps before we even enter and start putting to paper something like the New Deal, perhaps we need to step back for a moment and think about whether we are using the right language as scientists and as researchers in articulating the severity of the problems. Because I think that many of our colleagues, my mechanic down the road, the lady that cuts my hair, I think they all understand the problem. I think what puts them off from their interest in the problem is the way I articulate it to them. And perhaps people like myself and people like you and people like the attendees on this talk need to think about how we are articulating this and whether we are using the right language. And perhaps, you know, someone like me who has a few papers that have probably been read by nobody else except myself and the co-authors need to think about policy relevant science and whether we are encouraging our students to do science that it will benefit the cause. And I like what you said about the dichotomy. It's not a compromise. How are we encouraging our students? Are we encouraging our scientists? Are we encouraging our action researchers to actually do science that is policy relevant? Or have we all been caught up in this bean counting madness of publishing research that doesn't in effect speak to the real issues and doesn't in effect use the right language that articulates the problem to the broader audience? Morne, you want to respond?
Sershen, I think all I can say, I just typed a little note in which I said, I think I always encourage my colleagues to speak to people who are most different from themselves, because we have a tendency to gain comfort in speaking to people who think similarly, and then our arguments become less robust. We need to speak to people more different, to people we don't often speak to, that sharpens us. And it also, if we have cogent arguments that we sharpen and hone during these conversations, it also possibly can influence their understanding where they might have missed something very obvious. But we all too often think that we have all of the answers. That's why many of these models that I talked about are merely models. They haven't taken into account even introducing the threats of invasive alien species or over-exploitation of biodiversity. These things have to be taken into account as well. But these are very multidimensional problems. They're not unsolvable, and with minds like the ones around the table here, I think, I feel very optimistic.
Morne, on behalf of the hosts for today, I want to extend a very, very, very special thank you to you. And I hope that the WWF continues its association with this symposium in the 3 sessions that follow, and hopefully a plenary towards the end may be on the cards to perhaps broaden this discussion in a sense. I hope that you've gained as well during the talk, and we will share some of the questions and comments that have come through to you. I'm sure they will also influence your thinking around this matter. And thank you for your dedication to the field over the last couple of decades. I think some of the things that you've done have inspired people like me, and please continue with your good work. I want to thank the technical team for their support today, Sally and team, UKZN, Fountainhill, the Institute of Natural Resources. We want to thank all our participants for today. Please be safe, and please keep those that are sick and those that we have lost along the way in your minds. We've just received word that we've lost Minister in the Presidency, Minister Jackson Mthembu, and it is heartbreaking. In my mailbox sits an email that awaits a response from him and his PA. And I think a lot of people will be shattered by this loss, but it is a reminder that those of us that are still around have to bear the torch. Keep fighting, take care, and be safe.
Thank you very much.